The forest of the Ardennes was silent, buried beneath a suffocating weight of snow. The trees bowed under ice, their branches gleaming like glass in the pale light of dawn. Every sound, every breath, every bootstep seemed to echo through a frozen world where even time itself had slowed. It was December 1944, and the cold had become the deadliest weapon on the Western Front. For the men of the United States Army, it was a kind of misery they had never known. They had fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, through the rain and mud of France, through the smoke and rubble of the Siegfried Line, but nothing had prepared them for this. The winter of 1944 was not just weather, it was an enemy. The temperature dropped below minus 20 degrees centigrade. The wind screamed through the pine forests like artillery. Snow buried everything: roads, weapons, foxholes, even the dead. The soldiers of the 99th Infantry Division, newly arrived and barely trained, found themselves dug into shallow holes along a front they'd been told was quiet. They wore thin wool coats and canvas boots meant for autumn, not the Arctic. Their gloves were cotton, useless against the frost. Many had no winter hats, only helmets that froze to their heads overnight. At night, they huddled together in silence, passing around matches or the last few shreds of dry paper to light makeshift fires. One private from Pennsylvania wrote his pocket diary, "It's so cold the rifle bolt freezes shut. I piss on it to make it work." Another wrote simply, "We burn everything: fuel, rations, sandbags, anything that will keep the fire alive." The smell of burning rubber and cloth drifted through the forest, a strange, ghostly scent carried on the wind. Then, in that frozen stillness, came the sound that changed everything: German artillery. On December 16, 1944, before dawn, the still air shattered. From the east came the deep rolling thunder of thousands of guns. The sky lit up orange beyond the tree line as the first shells fell, shaking snow from the branches. It was the beginning of Hitler's last gamble, Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes Offensive, better known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. The attack struck with total surprise. Under the cover of fog and snow, 3 German armies surged westward. Panthers and Tiger tanks rolled through the white forests, their engines muffled by the snow. For the Americans, it was chaos. Entire regiments were overrun in the first hours. Lines of communication vanished. Radios froze, roads disappeared, and compasses failed in the fog. But the weather that had helped the Germans strike unseen now turned against everyone. The same blizzard that grounded Allied planes also froze German fuel in its drums. Tanks stalled. Soldiers on both sides collapsed in the snow, their faces black with frostbite. Yet somehow, amid this frozen hell, the Americans refused to break. At the small town of Lanzerath, a single platoon of 18 men from the 99th Division faced more than 500 German paratroopers advancing through the snow. Their commander, Lieutenant Lyle Boak, ordered them to hold as long as possible. Wrapped in thin blankets, their fingers bleeding from the cold, they fought for nearly 20 hours. When their ammunition finally ran out, 12 were wounded, 1 was dead, and all were captured. But they had delayed the German advance for a full day, long enough for the rest of the division to dig in. The Germans couldn't understand it. One officer later wrote in his diary, "These Americans do not fear death. Even when they freeze, they keep shooting." Further south at Bastogne, the same story was beginning to unfold. The men of the 101st Airborne Division, paratroopers who had fought since Normandy, were rushed in without winter gear. They arrived wearing summer uniforms, their boots wrapped in rags, carrying rifles that jammed in the cold. They had no overcoats, no heavy gloves, and little ammunition. The supply lines were cut, the town was surrounded, and yet they dug in. The temperature fell to minus 23 degrees centigrade. Men slept standing up to avoid freezing. They heated their rations by holding cans over burning cartridge boxes. Frostbite claimed more soldiers than bullets. When the snow melted slightly during the day, it turned to ice again at night, trapping rifles, grenades, and even corpses in the ground. Private Eugene Duffy of the 101st remembered, "You'd wake up and your buddy next to you was dead, stiff as a board. You didn't even have time to bury him, you just pulled his blanket off and kept moving." And still they held. In the nearby forests, American artillerymen dug their guns into frozen ground so hard they had to light fires beneath the trails to thaw the dirt. Engineers used torches to unfreeze truck engines. Medics carried stretchers through snow up to their waists, bandaging wounds with cloth stiffened by ice. Even blood froze before it hit the ground. But something unbreakable had taken hold among them, a kind of quiet defiance. The men stopped complaining about the cold, they stopped asking for replacements or reinforcements, they simply fought. "We weren't fighting for glory," one infantryman later said. "We were fighting to stay alive, and to keep the man next to us alive." Every soldier had his own ritual to fight the cold. Some stuffed newspapers under their shirts, others lined their boots with gun-cleaning patches or tore up tent canvas for makeshift socks. Fires were forbidden near the front lines, so they built foxhole stoves from ration tins and bits of wire. The fires gave off more smoke than heat, but it was something to believe in. The Germans, for their part, had come prepared for winter. Their soldiers wore lined parkas, woolen caps, and fur gloves. They carried field stoves and heaters in their half-tracks. They had trained for cold warfare on the Eastern Front. By all logic, they should have been the masters of this frozen battlefield. But as one captured German officer admitted later, logic doesn't win wars. Will does. He said, "We had the clothing. They had the heart." By the end of that first brutal week, the Americans had lost towns, men, and equipment, but not their resolve. The cold cut into their bones, the snow blinded their eyes, and still they held the line. When word reached them that reinforcements were on their way, no one cheered. They just nodded, grinned through cracked lips, and tightened their grips on their rifles. The blizzard showed no mercy. Neither did they. In that frozen forest, surrounded and outnumbered, American soldiers discovered something that no weapon could destroy: the will to endure.
The town of Bastogne sat in the middle of 7 converging roads, a quiet Belgian crossroads surrounded by farmland and dense pine forest. Before the war, it had been a sleepy market town of cobblestone streets and church bells. By Christmas 1944, it had become the center of the world, the place where the fate of the Western Front would be decided. For the men of the 101st Airborne Division, Bastogne was more than a battlefield. It was a test of endurance, faith, and flesh. They arrived without winter clothing, without enough ammunition, and with only what they could carry on their backs. They had been pulled out of rest near Reims and rushed in trucks through icy roads to seal the breach in the Allied line. When they got there, it was already snowing. Within 2 days, they were surrounded. General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, was a calm, dry man with a soldier's sense of humor. When the German commander demanded his surrender, McAuliffe sent back a one-word reply that became legend: nuts. The word spread through the frozen trenches like fire. Nuts became a rallying cry, whispered through chattering teeth, scrawled on helmets, muttered into the snow before dawn. The siege began in earnest on December 19th. German artillery surrounded the town, pounding the American positions day and night. The shells fell without pause, exploding in the trees, showering splinters of wood and steel. Snow mixed with blood, forming a pink crust that froze solid. The paratroopers dug deeper into the ground, building foxholes roofed with logs and covered in snow for insulation. But the real enemy wasn't the artillery. It was the cold. At minus 20 degrees Celsius, frostbite became a daily killer. Men woke to find their fingers blackened, their toes numb beyond feeling. Boots froze to their feet. The medics had no morphine, What little they had froze in glass ampules, so they used knives heated over candles to cut away dead flesh. Private Bill Greiner of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment remembered wrapping his feet in burlap soaked in kerosene, hoping the smell would keep rats away while the faint heat eased the pain. He said it didn't, but it gave us something to feel, and that was better than nothing. They had no blankets left. Most had been lost during the retreat. Some men tore the linings from destroyed jeeps and wrapped themselves in the greasy fabric. Others used parachute silk, thin as paper, but at least something between skin and air. Rations ran low. Sea rations froze solid in their tins, so they chipped them with bayonets and thawed them in their mouths. Water came from melted snow, which had to be boiled to prevent dysentery. But fuel was gone too, so they melted it over candles or burning scraps of wood torn from barns. The fires gave off smoke that drew sniper fire. Many preferred to stay hungry and cold rather than risk a bullet. In the aid stations, makeshift tents dug halfway underground, the wounded lay shoulder to shoulder in the freezing dark. Blood froze on bandages. Nurses and medics worked in gloves so stiff they could barely move their fingers. The generators coughed, sputtered, and died. Yet no one stopped working. Lieutenant Mary E. Roberts, one of the few nurses at Bastogne, later said, "You stop to think about the cold, and you die. So we just didn't think." Outside, the front line stretched across snow-covered fields and forests. Men stood in the open for hours at a time, rifles cradled under armpits to keep the bolts from freezing. When they fired, the recoil cut into numb shoulders. Some tried to warm their guns over candles, only to have them explode from condensation when the metal met the cold again. They fought anyway. The Germans couldn't understand it. Their soldiers were better equipped, wearing thick wool coats, leather boots, and fur-lined gloves. They had the firepower, the numbers, and the encirclement. But Bastogne didn't fall. Every attack was met with stubborn resistance, rifle fire from invisible foxholes, mortar shells that seemed to come from nowhere. The Americans were ghosts in the snow. One German officer, Oberleutnant Karl Mauser, wrote in his diary, "They do not feel the cold. They do not die like normal men. We shoot them, and they crawl back. We burn them out, and they return." For the Americans, that was partly true. Not because they were fearless, but because they had gone beyond fear. The mind stopped registering pain after a while. The body adapted. They were fighting not for orders or strategy anymore, but for one another. Sergeant James Atkins of the 502nd PIR recalled a night attack that summed up Bastogne's spirit. He said, "We were freezing, hungry, half dead. They hit us with mortars, machine guns, everything. One of my boys, Miller, got hit in the leg. He looks up at me and says, 'Don't let him take my boots, Sarge. I just got him warm.' That's what it was like. You didn't think about dying. You just thought about keeping your boots." By Christmas Eve, the siege reached its peak. Snow still fell, thick and endless. The men had been without resupply for nearly a week. Every night the horizon glowed with the flashes of artillery, red against white, hell reflected in ice. Then, sometime in the early hours of December 24th, the sound they had been praying for filled the air. Aircraft engines. The weather had cleared. C-47 transport planes appeared overhead, dropping parachutes that blossomed across the sky. Crates of food, ammunition, and medical supplies thudded into the snow. Some men wept openly, others laughed. One paratrooper, seeing chocolate bars and cigarettes among the drops, shouted, "God bless the Air Corps and God bless Lucky Strike." For the first time in days, they felt something like hope. That night, McAuliffe sent a message to his troops, printed and distributed through the lines. "To the gallant men of the Bastogne garrison, the Germans have surrounded us, cut our lines, and demanded our surrender. We are holding. We are not losing. We are going to hold this town until the relief gets here. Merry Christmas." They read the words by candlelight, smiling through cracked lips and frostbitten faces. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the trenches, covering the dead, softening the sound of distant gunfire. But the fires of Bastogne still burned, small, defiant, and alive. For the men who refused to freeze, survival had become victory.
The siege of Bastogne had become a frozen nightmare. But inside that nightmare, something began to change. The cold no longer broke the men. It sharpened them. Every nerve had gone numb. Every layer of pain had already been endured. The Americans were now creatures of the snow, pale, silent, and relentless. The Germans still had the numbers, the guns, the armor, but the men of Bastogne had something else. They had adapted. By December 25th, frostbite was spreading faster than infection. Medics recorded more than 1,000 cases in the 101st Airborne alone. Hands turned black, toes lost, flesh that would never heal. But most refused evacuation. "You can't walk on one foot," one medic told a soldier with a frozen leg. The man laughed through cracked lips and said, "Then I'll crawl." He did. Back to his foxhole, rifle slung across his shoulder. The human body can only take so much cold before it begins to shut down. At -20 degrees Celsius, the blood thickens, the heart slows, the mind begins to lose track of time. Some men hallucinated, seeing home or hearing music that wasn't there. Others just stared into the endless white, waiting for dawn. Yet when the German assaults came, they snapped back to life with animal precision. At Foy, a small village north of Bastogne, paratroopers from the 506th PIR took positions among shattered barns and stone walls. The Germans advanced through fog, their breath pluming in the air. The first bursts of machine gun fire echoed through the snow, dull and distant like muffled thunder. American gunners waited until the panzers were less than 100 yards away before opening fire. Bazooka rounds hissed through the freezing mist, shattering armor, igniting fuel. The blast waves rolled across the snow, throwing up clouds of white that glowed orange in the firelight. One paratrooper remembered, "The snow was our camouflage, and it was our coffin." When night fell, the wounded lay where they fell. No one could move them. The ground was too hard to dig. The medics wrapped them in blankets and prayed the cold would keep them alive until morning. The men began to speak less and less. Conversations became gestures, nods, grunts. A shared look meant more than words. In the frozen stillness, silence became their language. But underneath that silence was something unbreakable, a rhythm of survival. They rotated watch shifts every 2 hours. They melted snow for water in tin helmets. They scavenged boots and gloves from the dead, friend and foe alike. Sergeant Tom Red Killing of the 327th Glider Infantry later said, "The first week, we were afraid of dying. The second week, we were afraid of freezing. By the third week, we weren't afraid of anything." It wasn't bravado, it was transformation. The cold had burned away everything but instinct. Fight, eat, sleep, shoot, survive. For the Germans, Bastogne had become a graveyard of momentum. They attacked again on December 27th, hoping to crush the pocket before Patton's relief arrived. Their artillery was heavier, their tanks more numerous, but the snow betrayed them. Engines froze, tracks slipped on ice. The forests echoed with the groaning of metal as Tiger tanks tried to climb slopes glazed with frost, their treads spinning helplessly. The Americans waited in ambush. They had learned to listen, to feel the vibrations through the frozen ground before they saw the enemy. When the first tank appeared, its exhaust billowing into the pale sky, they let it pass. Then came the infantry, bent low against the wind. The paratroopers opened fire from every direction, turning the white silence into a storm of bullets and flame. One paratrooper remembered, The snow was our camouflage, and it was our coffin. When night fell, the wounded lay where they fell. No one could move them. The ground was too hard to dig. The medics wrapped them in blankets and prayed the cold would keep them alive until morning. The men began to speak less and less. Conversations became gestures, nods, grunts. A shared look meant more than words. In the frozen stillness, silence became their language. But underneath that silence was something unbreakable, a rhythm of survival. They rotated watch shifts every 2 hours. They melted snow for water in tin helmets. They scavenged boots and gloves from the dead, friend and foe alike. Sergeant Tom Red Killing of the 327th Glider Infantry later said, "The first week, we were afraid of dying. The second week, we were afraid of freezing. By the third week, we weren't afraid of anything." It wasn't bravado, it was transformation. The cold had burned away everything but instinct. Fight, eat, sleep, shoot, survive. For the Germans, Bastogne had become a graveyard of momentum. They attacked again on December 27th, hoping to crush the pocket before Patton's relief arrived. Their artillery was heavier, their tanks more numerous, but the snow betrayed them. Engines froze, tracks slipped on ice. The forests echoed with the groaning of metal as Tiger tanks tried to climb slopes glazed with frost, their treads spinning helplessly. The Americans waited in ambush. They had learned to listen, to feel the vibrations through the frozen ground before they saw the enemy. When the first tank appeared, its exhaust billowing into the pale sky, they let it pass. Then came the infantry, bent low against the wind. The paratroopers opened fire from every direction, turning the white silence into a storm of bullets and flame. One paratrooper remembered, "The snow was our camouflage, and it was our coffin." When night fell, the wounded lay where they fell. No one could move them. The ground was too hard to dig. The medics wrapped them in blankets and prayed the cold would keep them alive until morning. The men began to speak less and less. Conversations became gestures, nods, grunts. A shared look meant more than words. In the frozen stillness, silence became their language. But underneath that silence was something unbreakable, a rhythm of survival. They rotated watch shifts every 2 hours. They melted snow for water in tin helmets. They scavenged boots and gloves from the dead, friend and foe alike. Sergeant Tom Red Killing of the 327th Glider Infantry later said, "The first week, we were afraid of dying. The second week, we were afraid of freezing. By the third week, we weren't afraid of anything." It wasn't bravado, it was transformation. The cold had burned away everything but instinct. Fight, eat, sleep, shoot, survive. For the Germans, Bastogne had become a graveyard of momentum. They attacked again on December 27th, hoping to crush the pocket before Patton's relief arrived. Their artillery was heavier, their tanks more numerous, but the snow betrayed them. Engines froze, tracks slipped on ice. The forests echoed with the groaning of metal as Tiger tanks tried to climb slopes glazed with frost, their treads spinning helplessly. The Americans waited in ambush. They had learned to listen, to feel the vibrations through the frozen ground before they saw the enemy. When the first tank appeared, its exhaust billowing into the pale sky, they let it pass. Then came the infantry, bent low against the wind. The paratroopers opened fire from every direction, turning the white silence into a storm of bullets and flame. One paratrooper remembered, "The snow was our camouflage, and it was our coffin." When night fell, the wounded lay where they fell. No one could move them. The ground was too hard to dig. The medics wrapped them in blankets and prayed the cold would keep them alive until morning. The men began to speak less and less. Conversations became gestures, nods, grunts. A shared look meant more than words. In the frozen stillness, silence became their language. But underneath that silence was something unbreakable, a rhythm of survival. They rotated watch shifts every 2 hours. They melted snow for water in tin helmets. They scavenged boots and gloves from the dead, friend and foe alike. Sergeant Tom Red Killing of the 327th Glider Infantry later said,
In the frozen hills east of Bastogne, the arrogance of the Wehrmacht began to crumble beneath the same snow that had covered their enemy. For weeks, German officers had believed that their winter offensive, their last desperate gamble, would break the Americans. They had planned every move with precision. Armored spearheads through the Ardennes, encirclement of Bastogne, annihilation of Patton's relief columns. The weather had been their ally, the fog their cloak. And yet now, under that same sun that had returned to bless the Americans, the German advance had turned to ash. The soldiers of the 5th Panzer Army and the 47th Volksgrenadier Division trudged west through waist-high snow, their boots soaked, their rations frozen solid, their vehicles starving for fuel. What was supposed to be a lightning strike had turned into a funeral march. They watched in disbelief as the enemy they had been told was soft, inexperienced, and ill-equipped continued to fight in conditions that should have killed them days ago. "The Americans are mad," wrote Oberfeldwebel Hans Kessler of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division in his diary, later found near Magaret. "They have no winter clothing. They sleep in holes in the ground, eat snow for food, and still they fight like devils. We have coats and boots, and yet it is us who fall back." In headquarters tents behind the lines, German officers argued over maps that no longer matched reality. The panzers were out of fuel, the roads blocked by wrecks, the bridges destroyed by Allied air power. Field Marshal Walter Model, the Furs fireman, paced in silence as reports came in of stalled divisions and retreating regiments. The offensive was supposed to reach the Meuse River within 5 days. Now, 2 weeks later, the front hadn't moved in 48 hours. The reason was clear to everyone but Berlin. The Americans refused to die. At dawn on December 29th, German infantry launched one more assault on Bastogne. The plan was simple: break through the southern perimeter before Patton's Third Army could link up. The attack began under a gray sky, with artillery shaking the snow from the trees. Hundreds of shells exploded across the fields, sending up geysers of white powder. Then the tanks came, dark shapes rolling forward through fog and smoke. From the tree line, the paratroopers of the 502nd PIR waited in silence. They were exhausted, hungry, and half-frozen, but their discipline was absolute. They let the first German squad cross the open ground before opening fire. Machine guns ripped through the quiet like tearing paper. Bazooka teams crouched behind frozen logs, their breath visible in clouds, and fired into the advancing armor. Flames burst from the panzer's engine decks, orange against the white. The attack faltered, then broke. When the firing stopped, the snow was littered with black shapes, burnt vehicles, shattered helmets, and the bodies of men who had marched into the teeth of an army that refused to fall. One captured German lieutenant, trembling from the cold and shock, told his American interrogator, "We thought you were finished. We thought you were freezing to death. But you kept shooting. You kept coming." In the rear, German morale began to rot. The veterans who had fought in Russia knew what was coming. The frostbite cases multiplied. Entire platoons were immobilized by frozen limbs. Rations spoiled or froze into useless bricks.
Even the mighty Tigers struggled. Engines cracked from the cold, hydraulics froze, and lubricants turned to jelly. Some crews lit small fires under their tanks to warm them, only to watch the flames spread and consume the very machines meant to save them. By contrast, the Americans, improvising with whatever they had, seemed to grow stronger. When word spread that Patton's armor was approaching from the south, the German soldiers realized that their trap had become their tomb. To the Germans who survived the fight near Bastogne, the experience was a revelation. They had been taught since childhood that Germany was invincible, its soldiers superior in every way: discipline, courage, endurance. Yet here, in the depths of a winter that should have killed any ordinary man, they watched their enemy hold ground through sheer will. One SS officer, Obersturmführer Dieter Hagen of the 2nd Panzer Division, wrote a letter that was intercepted by Allied censors after his capture. "We have seen the Americans fight without coats, without food, without rest. Their faces are white with frost, their eyes hollow, but they do not retreat. They do not even seem human anymore. I think they fight not for their generals, but for each other. We can defeat their bodies, but not their spirit." That letter, smuggled through the lines, would later become evidence in Allied intelligence reports of the crumbling German morale. By the final days of December, the signs of collapse were everywhere. German soldiers abandoned vehicles to the snow and trudged homeward on foot. Officers shot themselves rather than face Hitler's fury. Prisoners surrendered by the hundreds, their faces gaunt and their hands trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion and disbelief. At one crossroads near Neffe, an entire German company emerged from the woods waving a white bedsheet torn from a farmhouse. They were greeted not with gunfire, but with astonishment. A young American sergeant, wrapped in a blanket and covered in frost, stared at them and muttered, "They finally got tired of freezing too." The officer had come to a broken serded and made a second and public amendment with shape. The American replied, "You should have survived this weather." The officer replied, "Neither should you." They both smiled, a brief flicker of humanity in the frozen wasteland. As 1944 came to its bitter end, the Wehrmacht's once proud formations were shadows of themselves. Hitler raged in Berlin, demanding new offensives, but his commanders knew the truth. The Battle of the Bulge had failed, not because of tactics or numbers, but because the Americans refused to yield. German propaganda called them decadent, soft, materialistic. But on the icy ridges of the Ardennes, those same Americans fought with a ferocity born not from ideology, but from survival. They were cold, hungry, and broken, but they would not stop. For the first time, the German army had met an enemy it could not understand. When the snow began to melt at last, the bodies of both sides emerged from their shallow graves of frost. The battle had cost tens of thousands of lives, but its outcome was beyond numbers. In those frozen forests, the myth of German invincibility had died. The men who survived, on both sides, would remember the sound of the wind more than the gunfire, the silence of snow more than the screams. And the Germans, in their defeat, would carry one haunting truth home. The Americans did not win because they were stronger. They won because they would not die.
When the first rays of the new year touched the Ardennes, they revealed a battlefield frozen in time. Tanks stood half-buried in snowdrifts, their gun barrels pointing at nothing. The fields were scattered with the dead, Germans and Americans alike, preserved perfectly by the cold, as if the war itself had stopped to take a breath. But it hadn't. Under that pale January sun, the men who had survived Bastogne were about to write the final chapter of the last great German offensive of the war. On January 2nd, 1945, the thunder of engines rolled up from the south. Patton's Third Army had arrived. The snow cracked under the treads of Sherman tanks, their hulls glinting with ice. The relief column broke through the outer German lines near Assenoy and pushed into Bastogne just after midday. Civilians came out from cellars, their breath steaming, waving makeshift flags and crying. American soldiers, filthy, frostbitten, and half-starved, stood blinking in disbelief as the first convoy rumbled past. General Anthony McCullough met Patton's lead elements at the edge of town. The two men exchanged a salute. "How's it going?" Patton asked with a grin. McCullough, his face pale with exhaustion, gave the same answer he'd given since the siege began. "We're still holding." It was more than a line. It was a declaration of what had carried them through 3 weeks of hell. The men of the 101st Airborne emerged from their foxholes like ghosts. Their faces were gray, their lips cracked, their eyes sunken. Frostbite had claimed hundreds of toes and fingers. Some could barely stand, yet they laughed, smoked, and traded stories with the tank crews. One Patton soldier offered a paratrooper a cigarette and said, "Heard you guys were surrounded." The paratrooper smirked. "We were, but it was the Germans who got trapped." All across the Ardennes, the same story repeated. The German advance had collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. The mighty 6th SS Panzer Army was retreating east, leaving behind its wrecked armor and thousands of prisoners. The once feared blitzkrieg, the lightning war, had frozen solid. The Americans, who had fought with barely enough food, fuel, or winter gear, now found themselves surrounded by mountains of captured equipment. The roads were littered with the remnants of Hitler's last dream: burned panzers, shattered artillery, and abandoned horses lying stiff in the snow. In Bastogne itself, the survivors began the slow process of thawing out. Medical tents overflowed with frostbite cases. Surgeons worked around the clock, amputating blackened limbs, their instruments warmed over candles. Chaplains moved quietly among the cots, murmuring prayers for the dying and the saved. Outside, engineers cleared the roads, their bulldozers pushing aside the frozen dead to make way for supply trucks. The first hot meals in weeks were served: coffee, stew, bread, from field kitchens. Men whipped as they ate. The steam from their cups rose into the cold air like incense. In a letter home, Private Edward D. Rowe of the 506th PIR wrote, "We made it. I don't know how, but we made it. The snow is red in places and black in others. We don't talk much about what we saw, but I'll tell you one thing: the cold couldn't beat us, and neither could they." The victory was not just tactical, it was spiritual. The Battle of the Bulge had cost the United States more than 80,000 casualties, the worst single campaign loss of the war. But it had also destroyed the last reserves of the German army in the West. More than 100,000 German soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. Their armored divisions, once the pride of the Reich, were reduced to rusted carcasses scattered across the snow. For the Germans who survived, the memory of that winter became a wound that never healed. Many later admitted they had underestimated the Americans, not their weapons, but their will. The same enemy they had mocked as soft and materialistic had proven capable of endurance that defied imagination. As one German officer put it after the war, "We were trained to fight men. In the Ardennes, we fought machines made of flesh." As the front pushed eastward, the snows of Bastogne began to melt. The frozen corpses that had lain still for weeks thawed in the weak sunlight, their features softening, their weapons rusting into the earth. The living buried the dead in shallow graves, marking each with a wooden cross. Some men carved initials into the wood. Others left dog tags hanging from branches, a silent testament to brothers lost in the cold. In the quiet that followed, the soldiers of the 101st Airborne gathered in the town square for a brief ceremony. Chaplain Joseph O'Malley read from the Book of Psalms, "He maketh peace in thy borders, and filleth thee with the finest of the wheat." The men bowed their heads. Around them the wind whispered through the shattered buildings, carrying the faint scent of smoke and pine. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. The war was not yet over, but Bastogne had survived, and with it, something larger than victory had been won. When news of the defense of Bastogne reached home, America celebrated. Newspapers called it a miracle in the snow. President Roosevelt himself sent a message of commendation,
saying, "The gallantry and endurance of the defenders of Bastogne will be remembered so long as courage is honored among men." But for those who had been there, it was never about glory. It was about holding on, against the cold, against hunger, against despair. Captain Louis Rinaldi summed it up years later. "We didn't win Bastogne with rifles or tanks. We won it because we refused to lie down and die." As January 1945 turned to February, the front moved east again, through Germany, through the Siegfried Line, toward the Rhine. The men who had frozen in Bastogne marched forward, some limping, some missing fingers or toes, but alive. They carried the memory of that winter with them, the sound of cracking ice under boots, the hiss of frozen breath, the faces of friends lost to snow and silence. And when they looked back, they realized something profound. Bastogne was not a victory of weapons, but of will, a triumph of spirit over nature itself. The Germans had entered the Ardennes believing that winter would be their ally. Instead, it became the forge that hardened the American army into steel. In the end, the snow melted, the trees budded again, and the fields turned green. But for those who had endured that winter, the memory never thawed. It lived on in frost-bitten scars, in sleepless nights, in the quiet pride of men who had looked death in the eye and said, "Not today." They had fought the cold, the hunger, and the darkness. They had fought the German army and the elements of the earth itself, and they had won. The winter had not broken them. The winter had made them.